So when using the Synchronization API, your authorization requirements are going to depend on what type of application you're creating. If it's a service, then you won't have to worry about this refresh token concept. You want to know more about services, then you can go over to tutorials and synchronize a file from Azure Blob Storage. This tutorial walks through how you would use a server-side approach. But if you want to use a client, which is the more common scenario, then you would need this refresh token concept. So let's understand this better. Now, there are two types of calls when anyone who's using the iTwin APIs might encounter. The first type of call is the immediate call. So these are fast calls where as soon as you request, the client requests something, a response comes back. But some calls take a long time to execute. Now, these are long calls. Synchronization API has one of these calls, which is to run synchronization itself, running a connection. Now, synchronization can take a long time depending on what type of files and number of files that we have in the synchronization job. There's an upper limit on the files that can be included in a job, so we could potentially run into jobs that take longer than an hour. Now, this is where things get interesting. Now, of course, iTwin APIs take the idea of security very seriously, so you do need some sort of authorization token to be able to access the iTwin API, and the user requesting the token needs access to that particular API. So that's how we make all the requests from the client into the iTwin APIs. But what happens when there is a long call that takes longer than an hour? Now, in this call, the process could still be going on in the background and the authorization token expires. Now, how would the API continue to execute that process? So that's where we provide the refresh token for a user. A refresh token is a token that's stored on the API side, and it has the ability to refresh itself. So every time it expires, it can reach out and request a new token, which is then used for the rest of the process. And this way, these long calls can be handled, and there's a persistent authorization for that particular user when they execute these long jobs. So this call that we see here, get authorization information. What this does is it checks to see if there is a refresh token on the API side for this particular user. So we can run it right now and see what we get as a response. So it does require a redirect URL. So over here, we can just pass in localhost 3000 as an example and hit execute. And you will see that user is not authorized. So there's a false for this value. This means that there is no refresh token on the API side for this user, so they can't run those long jobs that take longer than an hour. The API also returns this authorization URL. So we can copy this and paste it in our browser. And this authenticates the user. So it says successfully authenticated. Now this user is going to have a refresh token, which will take on these longer synchronization calls. And just to show you the response for this call now, let's hit execute again. And you will see that the is user authorized property is set to true. So that's what's going on here with the refresh token. That's why it's such an important concept. Now, one key thing to note here is just because this user has a refresh token does not mean that they will not need an authorization token to actually make the call. The user still needs an authorization token to actually make the call for running the synchronization, and the responsibility is going to be passed on from this authorization token to the refresh token for that user, and that's how these tasks are going to be executed. And just to see a visual of that, so an example command is going to be run storage connection. This is a command that could potentially take a long time. So when we click try it out, there's a refresh token for this user already in the backend, but we still need to pass in an authorization token to actually make this call happen. So that's how authorization works when it comes to using the Synchronization API on the client side. And now in the next video, let's take a deeper dive into our two types of workflows, these storage connection calls and the manifest connection calls, and actually see them in action.